Welcome to our 10th annual Humanities Symposium entitled Baggage, a retrospective exhibition of the work of our senior artist in residence, Alex Caldiero. I'm Kim Abunuwara, the coordinator of the Humanities program. I know that the Humanities 1010 Symposium entitled the Humanities 1010 classes of Eric Robertson and Randy Bernhardt are here, so I welcome to you and welcome to whomever else may be tuning in. Our symposium is one of my favorite times of the year when we get to gather as students and faculty and explore art and artists and scholarship that we love. Obviously, we usually do it in person, and this year, because of the pandemic, we thought we might have to cancel it. But when UMOCA announced this exciting retrospective of Alex's work, we proposed that we collaborate and we moved our symposium online. And so here we are. Professor Scott Abbott and Evan Jones, along with Alex, of course, have created a really beautiful website, thesonosopher.com, where you went today in order to access the portal to this session. And I hope you'll find time to return to that site and to explore Alex's visual art, his poetry, chapbooks, and recordings of past performances. It's really something. It's a great resource. It's important to thank the Utah Museum of Contemporary Art, Laura Allred Hurtado and Jared Stephenson, for their support of this symposium and their beautiful curation of the exhibit. And I strongly encourage you to attend the exhibit in person at the museum. I went last night with my husband and it's just extraordinary. So I hope you won't miss it. Because of the pandemic, they only allow 10 people into the exhibit at a time. So you need to go to their website and register to attend. This session is the penultimate session of the symposium this year, which began Monday, and recordings of previous sessions can be found on the website. The final session is tomorrow at 11 a.m. and is a discussion with scholar Tyler Chadwick, whose dissertation explores Caldiero's work. Yesterday, Travis Lowe and Torben Bernhardt spoke about their creation of the documentary film about Alex called The Sonosopher. The session really exemplified to me the kind of student-centered experience we're so proud of in the humanities program. The documentary was a capstone thesis project for Torben and Travis when they were completing their degrees at UVU. Both the Integrated Studies Department and the Humanities program require students to create a capstone thesis or project. But as you'll see with the Sonosopher, as it demonstrates, this project can be so much more than a requirement. It can and it should be something that arises organically out of the experiences that you've had in school and your interests. Another example of our interest in student experience is this panel. It's been our practice for the last few years to host a student panel as part of the symposium and give our students a chance to present on the topic. And today the topic is the work of Alex Caldiero. Alex Caldiero is a teacher, a poet, a performer, a musician, and a scholar of humanities and intermedia. Alex's poetry can be read like other poetry, and his artwork can be looked at like other artwork. But once you've had the chance to witness Alex perform his words and images, then you realize that his work is very different from poems and paintings that you may have encountered before. The best way I can think to put it is that Alex's work is alive. Sometimes the words come apart, unravel, and turn into mere sounds, as do his images. When Professor Scott Abbott at the 11:30 performance this morning asked Alex how he chooses a set of poems for a performance, Alex responded that it isn't just him choosing, but it is him responding to the material. That one poem calls for another, and he responds to that call and allows that flow of the material to happen. It's in this way that Alex's work is living. All right, to our session. I'm going to introduce each of our speakers as they present. At the end of the session, we hope to have time for questions and answers, and we invite you to pose your questions in the chat as they come to you. Our first speaker is Jody Chadwick. Jody's had a privileged kind of backstage view of this exhibition, as she has worked as an assistant to Alex throughout the process. Jody is a Humanities and Mathematics Education major at UVU. She also works at a high school as a Math Aide in Orem, Utah. When she's not assisting students with math, she enjoys discovering old films and TV series. The title of Jody's paper is Alex Caldiero, Outside Self-Portraits.
Thank you, Kim. I'll just start right in. So what constitutes a self-portrait? By definition, a self-portrait is a work that depicts the artist that it can be drawn, compiled, painted, or photographed by the artist themselves. We can see throughout history the prominence of this concept. Self-portraiture can be an exploration that looks at the definition of self. Most portraits are realistic and resemble the author. Other self-portraits depict how an author wants to be seen or how the author sees themselves. Self-portraiture can be used as a study of an artistic concept. We can see this with early Rembrandt and his self-portraiture used as a study to study chiaroscuro and facial expressions, clothing, shadows. The use of self-portraiture was mostly used as a promotional tool, specifically with paintings in the early Renaissance and the mid-15th century. This kind of showed the finesse for portraiture, which led people of the time to hire these artists to make portraits for themselves. These self-portraits were kind of just tools of the trade. And these self-portraits also fit within rules and conventions that are set up by art structure and in art institutions that have been established. Fast forward to present day, what is a self-portrait in the realm of today? The difference between Renaissance portraiture and portraiture of today seems kind of different. And to understand Alex's self-portraiture, it helps to review a few art movements or art periods which had a strong influence to actually understand Alex's self-portraiture. So the Dada movement consisted of artists who rejected the logic the art that was composed during this movement incorporated words, onomatopoeias, and mechanical nonsense embedded in the artwork. Dada's rejection of this tight correlation between words and meaning kind of developed a characterization of words within art, or words as art. This characterization is not the meaning of the words, but the words themselves, the way that they are put in context, or not the context, but the style. And just how the style as they were written, typed, drawn, or how they fit within an art piece. And those with this movement challenged the definition of what art was, what it constituted. They threw caution to the wind, as it were, and created something that didn't conform to the rules and conventions that governed art. We can also see this with beat authors, which is the next movement I'll cover just briefly. These authors rejected common social themes of their time, which was in the 1950s. And the values that these authors rejected was economic materialism and the general personal values at that time. And these authors also used explicit language to shock and jar their audience, as well as exploration of the human condition. meaning they used recreational drugs and activities to inform their writing and inform what they were writing about. And we can also see this in outsider art. And outsider artists were those who broke down classical conventions of what art should be. Outsider artists are self-taught or naive art makers, typically those labeled as an outsider. Outsider artists have little to no contact with mainstream art or art institutions in general. These artists completely rejected economic structure, the economic structure of art dealership and the institutionalization of academic classical art. These three movements all kind of revolutionized the definition of art, as most art movements do, but they fought to expand art from a professionalistic setting to make it about uniqueness, instinct, the creative endeavor, self-expression, and passion. And the anti-establishment revolutionary energy of these movements can be found in Alex's self-portraiture. Alex himself challenges self-portraiture as he challenges the roles that he's been given to play, like teacher, learner, professor, statistician, programmer. We all have these titles that society gives to us, and we strive to attain them. But what Alex does is he creates depictions of himself that say that he is a writer, he is a poet, and a purveyor of truth. The following words are written around his portrait. Look up from out of the shapeless mass of what comes forth to claim or say, and make a statement regarding the very thing that this very subjective face before and behind the portrait never portrayed or seen. His drawing of himself might correspond to his appearance, but his words refer to the parts of himself that never appear. The parts that can't be named with titles or forms. We as human beings want things to fit in a box. But Alex reminds us that the essence of the human condition cannot be contained. Our essence is boundless and of self-discovery and awaits individuals daunting yet profoundly the desired experience, which can be described in the words of Billie Eilish, because I'm in love with my future and I can't wait to meet her, and I'm in love, but not with anybody else, but I just want to get to know myself. It's almost euphoric. As exploration of the human condition is endless yet finite. And Alex's portraits are spontaneous and they dive into the swimming pool of self-discovery. So Alex's portraits are very unrefined. They're mostly on lined paper, found in notebooks alongside writing. In Alex's portraiture, the influence of Dada can be seen as he captures non-realistic representations of himself. Alex's self-portraits seem to be haphazard. They support the uniqueness of the unconventional, and the fact that they are on graph paper and line paper speaks to the instinct of the moment. They're unplanned. These portraits come together and capture his mind at the moment of their creation, which speaks to the ever-presentness of the front of consciousness, the tangible thoughts that exist in our mind and that wander and weave through the front of our minds. In this case, the perception of self as it exists, we become strangers sojourning in our mind, being anthropologists, questioning the customs of ourselves. And Alex captures and catalogs those ramblings of the psyche and places them on a medium as an insight to create the corporeal piece of himself on paper. which is a testament of the need for spontaneity within art. And art doesn't need a plan. We can see that Alex uses color or does not, or that he implements and creates the shapeless mass. It doesn't necessarily matter. Its intent and formation of these forms make it unique and his own. Instinctually, it's difficult to be content with asymmetry, and Alex uses lots of asymmetry inside his art. And as humans, we look for symmetry, patterns, repetition. Alex's portraits are asymmetrical, and some only feature the right side of his face, the left either darkened or shaded in such a way that indicates that he could be right-handed as a physical trait. But this could also take on symbolic meaning. Symbolically, the right denotes the light, as in it could mean the right hand of God. There, the left, the displeasure and darkness within the eyes of God, understanding and refining the influence or the influences that we see. The left and right both contribute to our passion and our essence of the human condition, and they're not completely divided. Our minds have been divided into categories of logic and creativity, and some portraits of Alex's, the left is occupied with text. And this could indicate that logic side of his mind, processing aspects of his creative self, which occupies the right side, his creative side. Alex's self-portrait suggests that inner struggle, that internal struggle between instinct and the rational mind, or between the pre-linguistic and the linguistic self. Alex's self-portraits show him battling institutions, and they show the desire and leave on a whim, yet being pulled back to earth by corporeality of life that exists on the battleground of our own mind. Alex has captured his interpretation of the human condition and promotes our thoughts to do the same, as we are privy to his inner workings of his consciousness. Thank you.
Thank you, Jody, so much. Our next panelist, Hannah Slind, is a senior at the University of Utah studying English with a minor in ecology. We're really excited that Hannah could come down and we could have a participant of a student from the U come down. One of Hannah's mentors at the U is Andy Hoffman, who has been a participant in our symposium, who appeared earlier this week. He's a publisher of a lot of Alex's work. Hannah is currently working on her thesis, a poetic work about grocery stories. And the title of her paper is Alex Caldiero, Poetry Mapping a Sicilian Immigrant Identity.
I'm just gonna wait for a second for the live stream to catch up. Okay, so I am super excited to be here. I'm also super happy that I'm going after Jody, because I think that a lot of the things that she was talking about, I'm also kind of addressing through my paper. So hopefully this will give you guys lots of food for thought. I guess maybe here I can do my screen sharing thing. Share. Okay. And then present. Okay. Is this visible? Can people see this? I hope so.
Yes, it looks good.
Okay. Okay, so I am talking about Alex's work and how we can situate it in a map making context. As Kim and Jody have mentioned, Alex is like kind of a jack of all trades. He's like a writer, a poet, an archaeologist, an anthropologist, a builder, a music maker. One I would like to add is he is a Sicilian immigrant, which will come up later. I think this also, I don't know, kind of, no one has mentioned how wacky Alex is and how creative he is. And I think that, I don't know, I think that maybe as 1010 students, everything seems really rigid, but hopefully you'll realize that there's actually like a whole field of really wonderful experimental things that are not, I don't know, hard or daunting, but just like really interesting. Anyways, I guess I'll get started. I wanted to start with this quote from a book of Alex's that says that he uses language, ancient as well as modern, to evolve a living past within the body of the present. So Alex's poetry is really specifically tied to place. For example, I was kind of combing through all sorts of things when I was researching this paper, this presentation. I found out that he has built a shed or like a tiny house out of just reappropriated materials, like didn't go to Home Depot at all or anything, with his 7-year-old nephew, Clive. He has done archaeological compositions. For example, he has a book called Lost and Found, which was a collaboration between him and another artist. I just wanted to read a little bit from it. So a description of the project is like an archaeological excavation. This project reflects a collaboration of human activity on many levels. As it unfolded, different ideas, forms, and contents took shape and changed shape as two excavator explorers, Caldiero, a poet and alchemist of the human voice, I love that phrase, and David Furman, an artist and sculptor of small-scale environments, composed a mixed metaphor of sight and sound. For 2 years, they visited and corresponded between Los Angeles and Salt Lake City. Together, from distinctly different perspectives, they created a common ground in space and time. So essentially, their project was to take a space, I believe it was on the Salt Flats, and they basically transferred it inside to the UMOCA. So it kind of brought up a lot of interesting questions about, what is the meaning of a space? Like if you move a space from inside to like a, life-size diorama kind of, is it the same thing? How is it complicated by being switched to a different location? And yeah, Alex is really concerned with space and place. And then he even has a document where he defines splace, which is the mishmash of the word space and place, which he calls a continuum of constants and variables ensuing trans environment. So as I mentioned before, he's of Sicilian origin. He immigrated to the States. But I think that that's another, way that we can look at his relationship with space is that, he came from somewhere pretty far away from where he is now. And I think this is especially prominent. He has a book of Sicilian tongue twisters, which I'm going to read from. If you don't like inappropriate things, maybe you should cover your ears. So he describes tuna. These are all like Sicilian like riddles, basically. He describes tuna as it is not pig's lard, tomato paste it is not, it resembles your sister's twat. And I like to sew, and so he has one for threading a needle, which is like never gonna let me look at a needle the same way again. He says, I try and try to stick it in your ass, and I'll go on trying till I've stuck it in at last. So I assume, to me, these are just like, clutch my pearls, but, there's also the Sicilian, which I assume is the, more of the tongue twister element. Anyways, yeah, I just wanted to kind of focus on how his poetry is situated in place. And I thought we would maybe talk a little bit about what contributes to place. When I was first kind of thinking about this question, the first thing that came to me is kind of like environment, as kind of like a catch-all phrase for what place is. But I think we can break environment down into the senses more. So the ones that are mostly explored in Alex's work are sight, sound, and touch. So I'm going to talk about sight first. I'm going to start with this poem that says, "My inner qualities are upon my skin." I was kind of thinking about this when Jody was talking. Throughout a lot of his books of poetry, he has faces and self-portraits. And, most importantly, what I was noticing is like eyes. And I think there's like kind of an interesting phenomenon going on where there's eyes staring back from the page at the reader. And also as we're reading, our eyes are obviously staring at the page, you know? So it's like in some ways you're kind of making eye contact and like being observed almost. And at the same time, it's like you're observing this book, and there's this really powerful I don't know, notion of like sight and recognition. There's also all sorts of drawings printed in his books. His books are not just totally written poetry, I guess I would say. So he has like this from a book of poetry called "It Rains Even When It's Wet," the second volume. And then the one on the right-hand side is from "Who is the Dancer? What is the Dance?" which is a poem, or which is a collection of poems about his rafting through the Grand Canyon. So, you know, the one on the right, as you can see, like I interpret it kind of as like waves. And it says, "The tongue of the water speaks out." And then on the left-hand side, kind of like what I was talking about earlier, we have this face. Okay, so the second, we've talked about sight, and now we can move on to sound. So he, as you guys have heard, his website is the Sonosopher. He refers to himself as the Sonosopher. Sonosopher is kind of like a mishmash of just like splice is a mishmash. He's combining the words sound and philosopher. And I have so much admiration for this. I also dabble in poetry, and like the part I hate most is reading out loud. Like if it was my way, I would just like read all poetry silently and to myself. But Alex does a really great job speaking out loud, and he really has a talent for pulling all of the meaning out of a word. It's almost like an onomatopoeia, like, you know, like bang or crack or whatever, just in the sense that he really like saturates each word with like the thing that it's supposed to mean. So unfortunately I forgot to include a picture of this on the slideshow, but I'll just show it to you. One example of his use of sound is he has lots of performances where he's performing his poetry or other just like sound art, I guess I would call it. So for example, he has this score, like a musical score, and it says like he, ho, 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 and like here, I'll try to turn it around so I can show you guys. And there really is just like, you know, how many times he's gonna say he, how many times he's gonna say ho, you know, how is he gonna, you know, mix them up and say one or the other. So, you know, it's really, I was kind of surprised by that because it shows kind of how disciplined he is with this. You know, it's not just like, oh, experimental, whatever, you know, it's like he really, you know, he's rigorous. Okay, I was also going to talk about a work from, he had a Dada magazine a couple years ago that's really interesting to flip through. It's mostly just like collage and poetry. He has a poem called Redo in it, and part of it says, "Dam a river, reverberate and be completely off and away." And I put that out on the slide, how it's spelled, like completely. So yeah, he's kind of he's drawing your eye and your ear to the phonetics of words, you know, and how you say them versus how they're spelled, which we don't really think about when we're reading, because, you know, we've kind of like memorized all these words. But, you know, there are difference. Like, if you didn't know how to read and someone gave you the word like enough, like you'd probably struggle with like that GH, you know? So I think he draws attention to the difference between, you know, the spoken word and the written word. He's also very conversational in his books. He often is just, it feels like he's speaking directly to the audience, like there's no real like distance between. So there's a poem from his book, Who Is? And an excerpt of it just reads, "Tell me about your mom and your dad. I live alone with my mom. We share our deepest secrets, our deepest loves. Our eyes have the same focus." And it goes on, and he says, "It is just as I said, saffron is our favorite color." He goes on and says, "What are you saying? What do you mean? This is a fine exercise, but it's getting out of hand." So as he's writing this poem, he's also kind of interrogating and like questioning his audience, you know, like it kind of feels like in some ways you should be responding to him. And he's kind of like drawing your ear to the, like that impossibility, you know, that like his voice is coming out of the page, but he's not there for you to respond to. Yeah, so I think that sound is just like a really important element. Scott Abbott, who I think he had a conversation with earlier this week, or at least they're really good friends. And Scott Abbott is another academic, and he calls Alex's performances, he says that they transport, enliven, seduce, and fulfill. So if you ever get a chance to go to one of his performances, you definitely should. Okay. Before I go there, the last sense that I'm going to talk about in relation to place is touch. I'm going to start with a poem from his book Some Love, which is dedicated to his wife. It's kind of about, it's loving, affectionate poetry. It's the last poem in the book. It says, "Nonchalantly, I open my side, take out my heart, hold it, still beating in my hands, and insist that everyone come close and verify that this is no trick." This was kind of the poem that got me started on this whole journey. I just really love it. This, I don't know, this kind of like physicality and like confrontation of the body, you know, that he's going to pull his heart out of his side and you have to come look and like make sure that, you know, it's not a joke, or like it's not a like a, you know, some like flaw in your eyes or whatever. But he has little, I guess I would say, like combinations of, he's basically trying to attract your focus to the bodily aspects of his work. And, you know, touch is a really great way to do that. In another class I'm taking right now, we're reading some like literature that's focused on race, and my teacher made this great comment that like you can say that you're, you know, like friends with a person of color, you can say that, you know, you're not racist or you have no problem, but it's another thing to be able to touch another person. Like that's kind of the signal of I don't know, like racial acceptance is, you know, like touching someone and not being afraid of, you know, them being contagious or gross or, you know, whatever it is. So along the lines of touch, he says things like, "You broke your nose the same way you broke your promise." He says, "Turn the other page, like turn the other cheek." He says, "Stretch of beach washed onto the page. Eyes touch flesh looking at you." So he's really, yeah, he basically is just drawing your attention to the physical page, the act of holding a book, the act of the book as a body, you know, like we talk about a body of work. And I don't think that's any coincidence, like that we have this connection between, your physical body, like the person that you are, like your physical bodily boundaries, but also, that there's this really powerful connection between that and the work you produce and the like emotions you express and the art you make, like those are kind of an extension of your body too. So I think that he's just, he's drawing your attention to like, this is a body too, like this is a document, but it's also like, kind of similar to like your body. Okay, so we've talked about sight, sound, and touch. And you're probably like, why am I going on and on about this? I basically, I just want to kind of point out all the senses, because Alex does a really great job of kind of weaving a web between all of his like different ways that he works. He has his written word, he has this more conversational tone, and his performances, and also his drawings. And I read somewhere in my research that he thinks that kind of all art, like he's of the mind that all art flows from one energy, and it's kind of like interdisciplinary, like he doesn't really see like necessarily a boundary between between like writing and between drawing and between speech, which I can see, like, you're using the same lines to make a drawing as you are to, write a word, and the same word you're writing is the same word you're speaking. But I also kind of think it's useful to think of his works in terms of the separate disciplines and the way that he translates between those disciplines, kind of back to like his Sicilian translations, the way that he, works between and strengthens the bonds between his drawings, his prose, his poetry. And yeah, basically, I'm trying to get at the idea that everything that he's making is somehow in translation. It's in translation from his brain. Maybe it's in translation from Sicilian. Maybe it's in translation from poetry to a drawing. And the way that he's doing that, the way he's designating the meanings of his work across different types of media, that's kind of the same principle behind map making. And this is kind of strengthened by a couple things in his work. He always includes like the time and the date, like under his poetry, which I first was noticing because it's always like, like 3:11 a.m. that he's writing this, and I'm like, why are you in bed? But yeah, he just, I don't know. I think that there's just like a really firm sense of place and time, just all across his work. Okay, so why do we care about this? I think the mapping is really useful for a couple of reasons. It kind of, it maps, you can map to like a bunch of different things that are pretty useful. Like, I don't know how useful mapping is just as an exercise, but the things that he maps to are really interesting. His work maps to like his sentiment, his voice, his frame of mind, his emotions. He also maps to geographic locations, like in his book of Sicilian poetry. In some ways he's mapping to Italy. And he has a book called Who is the dancer, what is the dance? I struggle because it's in cursive, which is about his river trip, so that's really firmly grounded in like, the geography of the desert and of the river. He also, I think another point to mapping is that it fleshes out the physicality and the corporeality, like the bodiliness of the books themselves, and really strengthens that bond. Like if you're just reading a poem, you might not get the whole picture, but if you have like the spoken word, the written word, and kind of like the picture that he's drawn, like kind of like a picture paints 1,000 words, you really get an entire picture. And just in case you were thinking that I'm just like out on some crazy limb here, I thought I'd just read you a couple excerpts of him where he kind of more directly addresses this. So he has a poem called Below Above from his third volume of It Rains Even on Who's Wet. And just an excerpt of it says, push forward on this paper road to where? So there we have that imagery of like a paper road, you know, and like the geography and the space that can be encompassed by a book. In the same book, he says, he has a poem that says, trust the body to know the moves, to show and tell the alphabet we are, a vast little territory we know so well, tell our windows what to look out at. So I just love those words, tell the alphabet we are, and vast little territory, you know, it's like I have this tiny book, it's like the size of my hand, and yet, you know, it covers a lot. And it covers a lot of space, even though, you know, you wouldn't see that right away. Yeah, so, oh, and there's one more, sorry. Okay, there's also a poem called Body Map, if that's like as obvious it gets. It reads, an embrace folds the map in two, otherwise impassable distances refute the idea of travel. And I just love this. I think it goes back to the touch that I was talking about earlier, you know, like the embrace of the map. You know, maps are made out of paper as well. I also love that action of folding, you know, if you have like point A and point B, but when you fold it, they're like right together, you know, and it refutes the idea of travel. You know, I think that's so clever, and it's so lovely that, you know, we can move through, you know, books encompass a different space, and we can move through them different ways than we can in, you know, physical geographical space that we normally would work through. Okay, so what I'm getting at, why I'm saying all this, is that mapping just allows us to really get the entire picture. And by using all these different mediums, by working through, you know, writing, the oral and the textual terrain, he's just trying to represent, you know, the whole body. And I could even say his whole body. You know, I would see, especially, you know, with all this kind of is corroborating the self portraits, you know, like I just think that he's really, his work, his writing and his drawing is just really an extension of himself, you know, and like the way that he's representing himself. Yeah, so he using all these like methods to flesh out his books and make them really full. And I think the ultimate purpose of that is to make kind of a most engaging and satisfying work for his readers, you know, like it's much, well, I think it's much nicer. It's almost like seeing like a, maybe this is a poor metaphor, but it's almost like seeing like a film adaptation after you read the book, and like everything, you know, you see things from a whole different perspective, and everything gets fleshed out in a different way. So as his maps are, you know, as we know, like if you have a, you know, a map of the road or the state or whatever, you know, the primary reason we use maps is to help orient us and to guide us and to facilitate us to explore. So I think that, you know, Alex's work does that really well, and especially because his work is situated in an experimental poetry. Like he's really, like it's kind of really useful to us to have so many maps, because it's kind of confusing terrain, you know, it's not super straightforward. And I also think that his maps are really important because they kind of serve as a record of like where he's pushed the boundaries of things, you know, and like where his experimentation has gone. But also what's left to explore, you know, I think his work kind of like outlines that too. You know, like where his work ends and potentially where we as experimental poets can pick up, you know, so I think that's kind of like exciting that he has that legacy for us. Okay, and I just wanted to leave you with a last poem, just because I think it's another really great map poem. It's called 2425 from his first volume of It Rains on Who's Wet. It says, well, maybe I should show you the image first. There's like a bunch of scribbles and this tiny little poem right here, which I can't even read, but I'm going to read the helpful text above it. It says, X marks the point of origin and the point of conclusion. You can walk along the path and not think it is a way out of where you need to travel. So basically what I'm saying is you can take my word or, you can just totally dismiss it. But either way, I think, there is something to the mapping in his poetry. And I think it really, creates a really powerful reading. Anyways, thank you for listening to me.
Thank you, Hannah. That was excellent. Evan, should I wait for the YouTube video to catch up or shall I proceed? Okay. Hannah, I so appreciate your presenting the metaphors of thinking about Alex's work as a map and thinking about Alex's work as a translation. Those two metaphors have, I think, rendered Alex's work more friendly than I've ever experienced them to be, like as if he's trying to help me to make sense of my own experience. I think that's wonderful. And I look forward to talking about that afterward. But let's go to our next panelist, Christian Heftel. Christian enjoys languages, literature, and dabbling in a variety of movement disciplines. He holds a bachelor's in English from BYU and is currently studying at UVU while preparing for eventual graduate studies. The title of Christian's paper is What Kind of Thing Can This Poem Be? Interpreting Caldiero's Disuse, Desire.
Okay, thank you. All right. So let's see. Yes, I'm going to be talking about this poem, DCU or DCU. I'm not entirely sure exactly how to pronounce it, but Desire in English. And it's, let's see, is my share working? There we go. All right. So to start out, I'd just like to read the poem. It's short and it's striking, and I'd like for us all to be on the same page because we're going to be diving into it. So I don't speak Sicilian, so I'm just going to read the side on the right. The desire for thighs rises like hunger at noon and dazzles us. In the shade, we take off our shoes, and the figs seem to be small breasts, dangling, sweaty in the heat. And we wonder, what kind of woman can this fig tree be? So then, what does this mean? Or to put it in different words, what kind of thing could this poem be? So every time that we come to a new piece of art, especially if the artist is new to us and we don't know the sorts of metaphors or references or traditions they're going to be drawing on, we start to ask questions and we start feeling around for connections, looking for metaphors, symbols, looking for what do I make of this? And that's an experience I've had sometimes when I look at Alex's work and Alex Caldiero's. And so I kind of wanted to go through a little bit of that process and go through the experience of trying to look at, for me, as I tried to interpret this, what is this like? What is that experience like? And what comes to mind? And that felt kind of in keeping with some of the work that Alex Caldiero produces. So anyway, starting with what's here. We have a poem. We have two versions of it. We have it on the left and on the right. On the left in Sicilian, on the right in English, and there's a picture at the top. If we don't speak Sicilian, which I don't, we presume that the two poems say the same thing, but that's a bit of a matter of faith, unless we actually know it. After a little bit of judicious Googling and Google translating, I did find that, yes, they seem to be translations, one of the other. And then we can look also at the shape of it. It's another thing that's the poem as an object. It's got a certain shape to it. It's got a strong vertical in the middle, composed by those two different versions, the English and the Sicilian side by side. And then along the sides, you have those, it's a lot wavier, it's a lot curvier. So in this way, it sort of looks like a form poem, but it's not a traditional form poem where if you look at like the works of George Herbert, you'll see specific tables and altars and things built out of the words. And here it's a little more abstract. There are shapes that are interesting and there are trends that are interesting, but it's not necessarily depicting a particular thing. The inside vertical orientation, that kind of reminds me of a tree. We tend to think of trees, perhaps not all fig trees, but trees as being upright and vertical. But then the outside, that sort of shifting curved side, maybe that reminds us that in this poem, the tree is feminine, or maybe it reminds us of the shape of a fig leaf, which we have here at the top. Another sort of interesting thing we have in the poem, we have 3 stanzas, and then in the picture of the fig tree, we've got a leaf that has sort of 3 sections. There's certain parallels there. Or if you want to look at it a different way, there is the 1 fig leaf and the 2 figs, and so still a sort of unity of 3, which mirrors the shape of the poem. So then let's look at the text. Let's dig into that. The title is Desire, and the word appears again in the first line of the poem. So desire is obviously going to be important to our reading. And what kind of desire is it? It's the desire for thighs. And that's kind of unexpected. It's a little earthy. It's not the sort of detail you expect to see in a Petrarch sonnet or a Shakespearean blazon. There's a desire here. There's erotic energy, and it's not the sort of literary idealizations that we might expect to run across. And similarly, later in the poem, we see that the figs are described as breasts, but they're also described as small, dangling, and sweaty, which is not the way that breasts are typically idealized in love poetry or in current culture. It's not the sort of thing that you would probably say to a lover. It's like, oh, what do you like about me? Oh, small, sweaty, and dangling are not words that we consider lovely typically. So then this desire, it rises like hunger at noon to dazzle us. So thus it's lunchtime and we're hungry for thighs. So we have an equation between desire, perhaps a sexual desire, and desire for food that are linked. But then the use of the time of noon and the word dazzle also kind of links this desire to the sun. And even though the sun is at its highest point in the sky, desire is still rising. So as I mentioned before, I don't have any experience with Sicilian or with Italian for that matter, but I do have some experience in other Romance languages and with Latin. And after a little bit of sleuthing, I found that that Sicilian word stravidiri, in the last line of the first stanza, seems to be the same as the Italian stravedere, which comes from Latin words extra and videre. So extra is the same as in English, basically. It means more or beyond. And then videre is related to our word video. And so it means to see. So stravidiri or extra videre, that is to see beyond, to see more. And so I looked up that word in a dictionary, and it said that stravedere could mean to see something that isn't there, to miss-see or to see things, and also to love or to admire something to the point that one's judgment is clouded. And I thought those were all really interesting definitions and all possible here. There's this desire that blinds us to the point that we mistake fig trees for women. And that leads us to, I don't know, it's also perhaps a love, an admiration that causes us to see things in a new light. And in doing that, there's this sort of seeing things that aren't there. It's, well, A, it's madness, and be its love and see its poetry. So what else do we find in this poem? We find trees. There's the fig tree. And if we go back to languages, in a lot of Romance languages, the fruit of a tree will be feminine, while the tree is masculine. So if you have an apple in French, it's a pomme, which is feminine, and then the apple tree is the pommier, which is masculine. And in Spanish, it's similar. You have the manzana, which is the apple, feminine. The tree is manzano, masculine. So it's interesting here that bucking that linguistic trend, we have a feminine tree instead of a masculine one. But then if we think about mythology, there are lots of cases of women being identified with trees. In classical mythology, there's the dryads, who are the tree spirits or deities. And then in Ovid's Metamorphoses, there are lots of stories about women turning into trees. For example, there's the myth of Daphne and Apollo, where you have the amorous Apollo chasing Daphne, and just as he's about to catch her, she's delivered from his embrace by being transformed into a tree. And in this poem, there's an interesting reversal of that, because in the myth, male desire leads to a woman being turned into a tree as an escape from that male desire. Whereas in the Caldiero poem, male desire leads to a tree being turned into a woman. So then we've got trees, and then we also got figs. And the use of the figs is also certainly meaningful, because figs are a fruit with a long and rich mythological history. Figs are related to the Garden of Eden. We have in the Genesis story, Adam and Eve making aprons out of fig leaves to cover themselves, so thus perhaps being related to the fall or to shame. And in some versions, like this one by Michelangelo, the tree itself is a fig tree, and those, if you look at those leaves, they look very similar to the ones that from our poem. Interestingly, in this one, we have both Eve here, but we also have the serpent, who in this painting is depicted as female and as being inside the fig tree. Then there are other connections that the fig has. One that we're maybe a little less familiar with here is the fig gesture, which was and still is used in some parts of Europe. And it's this rude gesture that's kind of like used like we use the middle finger here. And you can read it in Dante. There's a sinner who is blaspheming, and he goes and gives the figs to God. And so why is it obscene? Well, some people say that it's meant to represent the female genitalia, sort of like the bird, flipping the bird is supposed to represent the male. According to others, it represents the genitals in sexual union. So either way you interpret it, it's still, there's this connection between figs and sexuality and women. And then that connection actually goes even further, because in Italian, one word for a fig, fica, can also be used as a vulgar word for an attractive woman or for the female genitals. And that word fica forms part of that word ficara that we have in this last stanza. And so one can ask, does that word affect how we're supposed to read the poem? Does it suggest an answer to the question of what kind of woman can this fig tree be? Possibly. But there are other associations as well. So figs are symbols of fertility related to the womb. And if we look at the picture, you see all those little seeds in there, and you see the shape of it. And there, you can understand why people would connect the fig to ideas of fertility, fecundity. And they're not just associated with the womb, but also, as in Caldero's work, with the breasts. And interestingly, I found that Alex Caldero is not the first to connect figs with the breasts. In the Romulus and Remus story, Romulus and Remus were found and suckled by a she-wolf, and there was this fig tree that's related to that story. That's the Ficus Ruminalis, and Ruminalis comes from quite possibly the word ruma, meaning breast. And so we have another mythological and Roman connection between those two. And another interesting thing sort of strengthening that is the fact that figs when they're picked, they kind of can ooze the sort of white milk-like substance. Again, perhaps related to that imagery. But then I also thought of along different lines, so most of these associations come from classical or sort of a Christian background. But there are fig trees that have, there are connections with fig trees to other things as well. And one of those is the, one moment, I'm trying to figure out how to get, there we go. And one of those is that the tree that the Buddha achieved enlightenment under is the Bodhi tree. Is a type of fig tree. And so then, one can ask, is there any sort of connection there? Is there a different sort of desire, perhaps, being talked about in this poem? Could there be? And does this change the way that we read the taking off of shoes in the second stanza? Because you can take off your shoes just to get comfortable or as a part of undressing. And in a poem concerned with desire, that removing of clothing may be erotically charged. But you can also take your shoes off as an act of reverence. In this context, the desire could then connect to the feminine and could connect the feminine and the divine, like in Goethe's Faust, where the eternal feminine tempts us upward. So what we find in this poem depends an awful lot on what we bring to it. Those are a lot of thoughts to have around 13 very short lines of text. So, do we read the fig tree as a metaphor for original sin and shame? Do we see it as a symbol of fertility, as a religious symbol? Do we, when we read it, do we think about Eve, of Daphne, of the Buddha? And the meaning that we ascribe to it, the feelings that we feel, the way that it touches us is going to depend a lot on our background and on the references that we attach to it. And to me, that's really interesting because that mirrors really well what's going on in the poem itself, where you have the poet who looks at a tree and sees something else. And so, our looking for meaning in a poem like this may, like the desire of the title, dazzle us. It may make us stravidiri, it may make us see beyond, see things that aren't there, which could either be a positive or a negative. And this sort of looking beyond could make us see a woman in a fig tree. It can make us overread a poem. It can make us see things that aren't there. And as I said earlier, seeing things that aren't there is another word for madness and another word for poetry, another word for love, another word essentially for being human, because it's a very human impulse that we have to find meaning in things. And we will find meaning, and we don't always know what meaning we bring to the thing and what meaning it gives to us. But at any rate, those are some of the questions that I ended up running into and some of the potential answers I had as I tried to answer. What kind of a thing could this poem be? Thank you.
Thank you, Christian. Thank you to all of our students on this panel. Just some really terrific questions raised. I'm going to forge ahead. I've been snuck over to the YouTube chat and copied and pasted some of the questions that are coming in as you guys are making your presentations. One of the first questions was for Jody. Let me see, it was Michaela Rawson who asks of Jody, what was your favorite thing that you found or learned from Alex? I think she's keying into your time working with him, assisting him. Is there a favorite thing you discovered from him or learned from him that you want to share, Jody?
Well, most of the time I would just print stuff for him, but I I found that he was very specific in what he wanted, but I also had to say, okay, let's see how we can create your vision and bring it to life. And so there was a slight part on like, okay, how do we want to make this work as a physicality sense? Because his mind is thinking about this, this creation in his head. And so that idea of just trying to help him, I found that he was very specific in what he wanted, but I also had to say, okay,
Shoot, Jody's your audio cut out right at the end, Jody. But I think we got the main answer to that question. Let's see. Emma Little asks, and I think this pretty sure this question was posed when Hannah was presenting. From your research, which sense do you think Alex performed the best in or enjoyed putting into his work the most?
Well, I think that I don't know. I mean, I haven't seen him write. I think he mostly seems to write in like the middle of the night. But kind of my gut reaction is to say that he enjoys like the vocal aspect the most, just because I've seen some of his performances and they're so like clever and like funny and joyous. I just like, yeah, it's like a totally, I don't know, wonderful experience. I was just looking at a question that was asking what my favorite like sense of his to explore was, or like my favorite element. And I think that my favorite is like all the definitely his like written word. I mean, I'm not a good speaker. But also his like the touch that he talks about so much. I just love all these images of like the books as bodies, and I find those like just really wonderful to think about and to imagine.
Yeah, when you shared with us that passage about him taking his heart out from his chest and calling people to come and witness that this is not a trick.
Yeah.
You in the profoundness of that and the way that had touched you was really conveyed in the way that you called attention to that.
Thank you. Well, and I just love that. I mean, I think that it's like there's multiple tricks going on. It's like within the frame of this paper, the trick that I was thinking about is that like, like books can function as bodies too, but I think there's also kind of like the trick of your heart beating in the first place, and like that's kind of wondrous in and of itself.
I'm glad that you point out how a trick can be a good thing, because I think the way I was thinking about trick was being tricked, being deceived, being tricked, and I was so glad to witness a passage from Alex's work where there's such sincerity, where he's insisting that this is not a trick, meaning no deception is happening. This is completely sincere. It feels like at this moment in time, sometimes sincerity is a little bit hard to come by. I don't know if you feel that way, but.
Oh yeah, I definitely feel that way. I mean, certainly, I don't know. I think in our politics and also just everything being online, I think it's really hard to, tell tone and tell sincerity. And I think that, we almost have like a lesson to learn from Alex that, he does such a good job of presenting, all these different facets of his work in a way that, makes you believe him and makes you think it's not a trick,
Yeah. Okay, Natasha Colburn posed this question for you, Christian. She says, I'm from Portugal, and with Romance languages versus English, structure changes a lot. In all caps, she's written. Do you think Alex's bilingual ability impacts how Alex often makes a point to break down barriers in words and sound?
Well, that's a really interesting question. I mean, I would say, I would guess so, because I think that just from personal experience, the more that I have worked in different languages and looked at different languages, the more that I have realized, I don't know, it's drawn attention to language and to sound and to language being a set of symbols and assumptions that we have that aren't universal. And so I think having experience with the languages that Alex Caldiero has, I'm sure that there is that sense that Hannah referred to of translating between them and finding play between them in terms of sentence structure, in terms of words, in terms of etymologies, in terms of all kinds of things. I think so.
Yeah, definitely. All of the discussion about translation, it started with Hannah and it continued into Christian's presentation. And Scott commented also in the chat saying how much he loves the metaphor of translation for Alex's work being a translation. I agree. But I don't know, when I see Alex's work and when I watch him perform and when I watch him take words apart and make them and break them down into sounds, you've seen him perform and how he'll either speed up to the point where they're just sounds or he'll slow down to the point where they're just sounds. It feels like he's unraveling and it has seemed to me like he's trying to get to a pre-linguistic, a pre-language place. Does the question of translation stop functioning there, or does it continue to function in that pre-linguistic place? Christian, what do you think?
I'm not sure, but I guess the thing that I thought of when you said that is the concept of pre-linguistic and of post-linguistic, and I think there's an attempt to get back to before language, perhaps, and also a sense to get through language to the other side of language.
Well, I really like that. I really like that idea.
I also kind of feel like when he slows things down or speeds things up, like I feel like it almost like meets, like, finds a point of clear translation. Like I think a lot of times, things that are translated are approximated, and so there's kind of like a like friction there that, like the poem on the left hand side is still, different from the poem on the right hand side. But I feel like when you just break it down to sounds, like, you can be speaking in any language and understand that, like, you're hearing a nonsense sound,
Exactly.
Like, I kind of like that. Like, it's kind of like a, like a universal, like it's like a universal language,
Exactly. Yeah. Were there any questions that the three of you wanted to ask of each other, that as you were listening to each other, you wanted to pose?
Well, Hannah, I really enjoyed the idea of mapping.
Thank you.
I thought it was amazing. I loved how you described about the folding of the paper. And how 2 points occupy space, because in mathematics, of course, we're always measuring displacement, the way things fit on a linear plane. And so I was connecting that. I was like, oh, okay, he's taking the conventions of the universe and just throwing out the window. And it's awesome to think about that as from a creative standpoint.
Definitely. I appreciate that. And it's definitely, I can't say I'm as advanced in math as you, but I at one point attempted a math minor, so I know enough to know about the way that, like, there's kind of like mapping in mathematics too. And so when I was thinking about this project, I was kind of thinking about like injectivity and surjectivity, which, if you don't know, is like all items in one domain getting mapped to items in another domain, but maybe all, like, not all of the items in the other domain are covered. And so I was kind of thinking about that and how, like, is everything covered when you draw something or when you, write something? So I don't know, I think it's kind of useful. And I have a question for you, Jody, in response. I just thought your whole conversation about self-portraits was really interesting, and I was wondering if you think, I don't know, like how you think of the self-portraits as a body, and whether you think that they like you can conglomerate them to build like, you know, an essential image of Alex, or Alex maybe as he sees himself, or if you see them like just as distinctly individual maybe, or if you could like talk about your perception of them a little bit.
I think that you could construct a body, as you say, of these portraits, because each portrait is a facet of his own personality. In looking at a lot of them, of course, there's like the highlight of the struggle of him trying to do the logic side, the artistic side, but some of them, they're vibrant with color. And I was trying to like break down what they actually meant in terms of how Alex sees himself, because self-portrait, I do feel like it is a part of his body. In this case, he's just putting it on paper. And so I would say, yeah, definitely that it is a body of work, but it's also a body within his mind.
Yeah, it's kind of like an impossible body. Oh, sorry, Kim.
No, I apologize. I'm just concerned that we're out of time. We've gone a few minutes over, and I know that some students are going to need to go. And so I guess I just wanted to take the opportunity to thank the three of you for participating. I just think it's been a great panel to see how you guys have engaged with Alex's work. So thank you so much for coming. And
thank you for having us.
Yeah.
Thank you.
We can sign off, but you can continue